When the music stops, I start talking. I don't see it's all automated now, you know. Okay, here we are. Actually, we made it this time. No ice, no snow, just cold. And we're here to do the midterm review. And so let's go ahead and get started so we know what's going to happen on our midterm. Okay, the midterm exam is going to be available to you 1 week only, and it begins Thursday of this week, and it concludes the following Thursday. So you have 1 week to get the exam done. It's over in the testing lab, as it says here, the testing or the instructional testing services. It's over in that fancy schmancy new center building, room 311. That's where you will take the exam. Again, you have a week to do it. And it is a objective exam. There will be 50 questions, all right? And the good news is you are allowed one 3x5 note card in the testing center. So what that means is exactly that. You can put information that you're unsure of or information that you think might be on the exam, but you're really not sure of the answer, and you can squeeze that onto one 3x5 card. You're allowed to take that with you into the testing lab. It's their rule, not mine. I mean, that's the way it is. They allow one card. So as I always told students, the stuff you're sure of, you know, don't sweat it. The stuff that you're sure of, just go ahead, you know, you've got it in your head, don't worry about it. The stuff that's a little bit iffy, you're not sure of, that kind of thing, get it on the card. Okay, study guides are now available on Moodle. The study guide essentially gives you an idea of what we have discussed from day one through the exam period. It gives you some specific information, some general information, but at least it gives you an idea of what you need to know in order to pass the test. You are responsible for your exam. You know, it is your responsibility to make the exam date and time. So do remember that, oops, that's the wrong website address. That has to be changed. I forgot about that. It's in your syllabus anyway, where you can check the available hours on at the testing center. Okay, there'll be no makeup exams, so because you got a week to do it. So get in there and do it. And now, this is what's going to be on the exam. It's going to cover everything from the classic Hollywood style through the romantic comedy through this week. So you need to know everything about classic Hollywood style through the romantic comedy. So let us begin. In the very start of our series, it talked about the movie industry. And essentially, it gave us two things about it. First, that it is an oligopoly, that it controls production, distribution, and exhibition of films. In other words, it makes them, distributes them, and shows them. And the second thing, which is very crucial to the Hollywood system, is the industry's use of genre to minimize financial risk. And that is something that we'll get to. But let's take a look at the overview of the American movie industry. Before we jump into that specific thing there, it also gave us a little bit about the history of the motion picture. It talked about early projection technology, and it talked about the notion of persistence of vision, which again, remember, is the idea of a series of still films or still pictures are projected, are projected. And in the silent era, it was anywhere from 12 to 18 frames per second, and that creates for us the illusion of movement. So that's persistence of vision. The key innovations in individuals here, the kinetoscope and what Edison did, what his pal Dixon did, the Nickelodeon era, the MPPC, that lasted roughly from 1908 to 1915. That is Edison's company. And the idea, the concept of the movie palace, in which essentially in the exhibition of movies, we move from a storefront simply rented to show a movie on a white wall to these huge palaces whose only purpose in life is to show movies and to give you an amazing experience. Okay, the classic narrative style was discussed. These are the ways in which cinematic stories are told. And the 5 things that they talked about are these: equilibrium and disruption, problem solving, temporal and spatial limits, the journey, and then they made this distinction between Aristotle's traditional unities and the ideas of segmentation in the movies. So let's back up and take a look at what we mean by equilibrium and disruption. It's pretty easy when you think about it. It's simply this: an initial state of affairs is introduced after which something occurs to disturb this equilibrium. In other words, a movie begins. If you stop and you think about any movie that you've seen, the movie, for the most part, in general, the movie begins with everything equal, everything in balance, everything is just a normal day in whatever town or whatever situation, okay? And then there is something that occurs that disrupts that equilibrium. And that can be anything. It's not just simply if we think it and reduce it to our known factors with regard to melodrama, which is the basic premise of all movies, in which there's a villain. Somebody does something to disrupt that equilibrium, but it could be a storm. It could be even an idea that comes in that just disrupts absolutely everything. The second thing there is subsequent events attempt to, obviously, restore the original status quo. But this is repeatedly frustrated and order is recovered only at the end of the film. Again, when you stop and think about any film, that's what makes the film interesting. That something or someone tries to restore order, tries to bring all of this thing back. The attempts are made and they are thwarted at every moment. But of course, the movie's going to run for 2 hours, and by the end of near the end of that movie, things get restored. Okay, now problem solving. That is also the part of our narrative. Over the course of the narrative, characters struggle to achieve their goals or solve their problems. All right, our primary character, the main character in our film, our protagonist, okay, he's struggling to achieve something. And sometimes it's just to reach a goal, and other times it is to solve problems. And this can be anything. It can be, how do we overcome the attack of a giant monster from outer space, down to a simple thing like, how can I get this woman to love me? They overcome those who stand in their way. They triumph over adverse circumstances and or transcend their own limitations. Most character studies, when you're looking at a film that emphasizes people as opposed to action, what you'll find is that they are transcending their own limitations. They are attempting to overcome something within themselves that keeps them from reaching some kind of goal or reaching something. And, well, that's pretty much it when we talk about character studies. Okay, temporal and spatial limits. Temporal dimension is, again, what it says. It's a specific deadline has to be met or a certain task has to be completed by a definite time. It's temporal, meaning time. In some films, time is of the essence. I keep going back to this film that was made in the late 40s called DOA, in which this man has been poisoned, and the entire movie is this fellow trying to find his killer before he dies. Very interesting film. Spatial dimension is what it says, characters moving toward precise destinations or geographical goals. These are very much what we'll talk about in a few moments, but the journey. That's the obvious one. In Westerns, it's getting from wherever, St. Louis or wherever it was in Missouri to Oregon. You follow the Oregon Trail and all of the issues, the things that you encounter. Okay, then now the next one is that sense of journey. Now, our video series and the book have an interesting take on it. In the narrative, of course, the journey, it's obvious. We just sort of mentioned that. Characters move not only spatially, but they realize other non-spatial goals as well, such as making deadlines, solving mysteries, falling in love, discovering new worlds, and coming to terms with themselves and or their fellow travelers. So when you look at a narrative, it's pretty obvious. They're on some kind of a journey. The journey might not be spatial in the sense that we talked about earlier about like the covered wagon train heading to Oregon, but it could very easily be from finding the body to discovering the murderer that you'd find in a whodunit detective story. Or in a soap opera kind of thing, it is meeting the girl, losing the girl, getting the girl back. Discovering new worlds, and of course, very similar to what we talked about earlier about the character study, coming to terms with themselves. Often the journey is going from, well, an obvious one and a kind of a simple one would be a man who believes himself to be a coward, but through the course of events, he turns out to be a hero, that he overcomes his cowardice. So it's that kind of thing in the narrative. Now, with regard to our film series and with regard to the book, they added another element of the journey with regard to film, and that is the audience's journey. It is, as they say, going to the movies. What we see on the screen is what we are doing at that very moment. We are identifying with images, with people, with things that are on that screen, and as such, we join in with them. It's a vicarious experience by looking for goals, participating in deadlines, and undertaking journeys. This is the kind of thing that we sit in that theater, we watch the movie, we get involved in that movie, and we are on that journey to get to Oregon with the rest of them. It's that sort of thing. And it's a clever way of talking about what it means about going to the movies, because in the traditional sense, in the classical sense, you went to the movies. There was no such thing as television. There was no such thing as DVDs, things like that. You didn't have it at home, but you actually made the trip to go to the movies to see something. I think it was Alfred Hitchcock, I think he said this once, that a good movie is when the cost of the babysitter, the cost of the dinner, and the cost of admission to the show was worth it. And so that idea is you had to make the effort, you had to go to see the movie. Okay, and then the last point was segmentation. Segmentation, it's a process of structural analysis that breaks the film down into its basic narrative units. Anybody who is involved in film making, in film production, understands this concept, because when you start writing a screenplay, it is pretty much broken down by elements. It's got scene 1, scene 2, scene 3, all of these things that take place. And in the actual production of a film, at least in a classic Hollywood sense, we're going to shoot all the scenes that take place in the office. That means scenes 1, 26, 103, and 156. Okay, those are all out of sequence at that time that we're shooting them, but we do it for budgetary purposes. But we shoot all of those things in there. That is very much segmented. And your actor has to be, he has changed. He could very easily have changed from scene 1 to scene 156. He has to do that in that single day that we're shooting inside that office. So that's kind of part of the difference in acting for film like that. But when we get it into the editing room, the cutting room, and we start putting all that stuff together, that segmentation begins to create a whole for us. Okay, this in opposition to dramatic unities, according to Aristotle, which is action, time, and space. And as you see, most films violate the traditional unities and lend themselves to segmentation. And so that was the point they were making. So it's a lot different from being on the stage. Okay, moving on. We should understand film techniques and relationship to narrative. Understand what mise en scène is. That's the term that is used to describe very simply what you see in that frame. Everything that's within the frame, you forget everything that's outside of it. The camera movement, the movement techniques, different kinds. When you move laterally like this, and it's on a fixed point, and it moves and swivels like this, that's a pan shot, okay? But when the camera itself on that pivot, on a dolly or a truck, and it moves, okay, that's a different kind of movement. It gives us a different effect. When it moves laterally like this, or if it moves on the Z-axis, the difference in camera movement, which when I was teaching film production, I always said there is a qualitative difference, very important qualitative difference between a zoom shot, if you're zooming in on a person, versus taking that camera and actually dollying into a close-up. There is very much a qualitative difference to it. So that kind of stuff to be aware of, and lighting, the different types and effects, three-point lighting, all of that, sound, what all, mics, mixing, scoring, continuity. The difference between a shot and a scene, a shot is turning the camera on and turning the camera off. A scene is a dramatic action. That is a dramatic point. You might have several shots within a single scene. Scene editing, editing within a scene, that's for Hollywood is called invisible editing. That is when when you start the film, you do a master scene shot. It's a master shot. It's a long shot. People come in, they do things, and they talk to each other. Then you move in for close-ups. So you move in for the medium shots on characters, to the close-ups and so forth, and then you cut that together. And you cut it from that long shot to a medium shot to a close shot, back to a medium shot, to an over-the-shoulder shot, to all of these various kinds of shots, and all of that is supposedly invisible. And then between scenes, we don't do much. The bottom line for today's Hollywood, the bottom line for filmmaking today is for between shots, it's the jump cut. It's very simply, we just jump to the next scene. In the old days, we had other ways of doing it to denote time and space, and that would be the dissolve and the fade. Scene organization, whether it's linear, circular, flashback, like Citizen Kane has multiple flashbacks, and that's how it is depicted. It is shown to us. Most of the entire movie, most of it is done in a flashback, and often flashback within flashback. Cross-cutting. Cross-cutting is simultaneous action. That's the most famous one begins, in the silent era and the Great Train Robbery, where, and the easy way to look at it is like, to depict it, is let's say we tie the poor damsel in distress on the railroad tracks, and then somebody's got to rescue her. So what happens is we see the damsel on the railroad tracks, we see the hero riding his stallion to come to rescue her, and then we see the train coming down the tracks. Okay, all of those things are happening simultaneously, yet we are cutting among those things. That's cross-cutting. Point of view editing, that's whether, it's the, from whose point of view it is. Most of the time it's from an objective point of view. It's just observing, but sometimes we go into it. The point of view, and all this is a filmmaking thing, the 180-degree rule. Most people don't pay any attention to that unless you're making movies, and that's where you draw the line, and you never cross that line when you're cutting to maintain continuity. And moving on, the studio system. Understand the Motion Picture Patents Company, that's Edison's group, the key players in the creation of early studio system, and those are the main ones right there. William Fox, Carl Laemmle, Louis B. Mayer, Samuel Goldwyn, and Marcus Lowe. The strategies of control, you should have a good idea of how the business worked. It's an oligopoly. Okay, that's vertical integration. And what that means is, in the case of the motion picture industry, the studio system established a market in which the studios are owners of their production facilities, the studios themselves, where they make them, the distribution outlets, the film exchanges, that's what those are called, and the theaters themselves. So Paramount Pictures, they make a Paramount production. It is given to their company, which is the Paramount Film Distributing Corporation, which has an exchange in Portland or Eugene or wherever, and is sent to their Paramount Theater. In other words, the studios control multiple levels of the marketplace from the top down, from production to exhibition. So that's our oligopoly. Then within that system, there are these practices, blind booking and block booking. Those are easy. Blind booking, or blind bidding as it's often called, and what they like to call it. Exhibitors are forced to contract for the rental of films prior to seeing them. Okay, simply that's what it means. It's blind. What they say is they create enough hype. And a good example of that, except they don't do it anymore, but a good example of that would be the Star Wars thing. This Star Wars movie that just came out at Christmas time. Enough hype was generated that theaters are saying, I'm bidding so much money to have an exclusive of this film without ever seeing it. And it happened frequently, where they create enough hype, the theater owner purchased the film, and it's a dud. But he had no way of knowing. Okay, the other one is block booking. When I used to work in a theater, my old boss used to just hate this. Exhibitors are forced to contract for the rental of groups of films to secure the right to exhibit any one film distributed by the studio. Back to our notion about Star Wars, it would be, if you want to show Star Wars in your theater, you have to also book 5 of our crappy movies. Then everybody knows they haven't been doing too well, have they? No, they haven't, but if you want our good one, you got to come and get our lousy films. Okay, and then we look at the runs, the zones, and the clearances. Again, the general definition here is a pattern of exhibition in which certain theaters secure the rights to exhibit films before other theaters are permitted to run them. The runs are these. New films are licensed only to first-run theaters, which are thus protected from competition with second and sub-run theaters. In other words, your run is, I get it first run, I get it exclusive before anybody else can have it, but I'll yield the second run rights to the theater down the block after the film is cleared. Zones. Only one theater in a certain geographical area will be permitted to exhibit the film in any particular run. And then the clearances between each run, a certain period of time will be established to enable the various runs to maximize profits. So in other words, you can't have, what they didn't want was, or the theater owners didn't want it, this was to their advantage, is saying, I'm bidding on running this movie at this time, and I don't want the guy down the street to be running the same movie. Okay, and then the Sherman antitrust ruling came in 1915 that broke up the patents company. So now anybody can have a movie camera. Previous to that, remember the MPCC, you had to get a license from them to make a movie. Okay, the next one, the 5 major studios. Okay, the big ones there, everybody knows that. Paramount, 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers, RKO, MGM. And then your minor, the 3 minors were Universal Columbia, United Artists, and also the low-budget outfit was known as Poverty Row. There's a whole list of those companies that were out there making, cheap movies. And they just did not own their own theaters, so they were at the mercy of all the chains. And then the Department of Justice Paramount case that came in 1948 that said you can't have that. You can't have this oligopoly. You cannot own production, distribution, and exhibition. You have to give up one of them, and the movie studio said, you can have the theaters, we're going to control production and distribution. Also have an idea about the average cost of film production over time, which everyone knows has increased. The rise of film artisans and independent film producers, and the bottom line about this is that old studios are now pretty much banks. Old studios finance, and distribute independently made films. Have an idea about the star. Basically, what you need to know about the star is that the stars have masks or personas created by the film studios. Again, we're talking about the classic Hollywood era. And so that's who you are. And in your private life, you're pretty much the same thing. The genre, what is important about genre, as we mentioned earlier, is that it stabilizes an otherwise unstable movie industry. Each new film banks on a number of familiar elements, motifs, and themes, but in a new way. It's the equivalent in music to theme and variation. Sure, we make a Western. The Western, it has the same elements as like every Western, but we do it in just a little different way. Westerns remained that way until a major shift occurred in the 1960s when the Italians started making Westerns. And then there was an entirely different shift in the way Westerns were made. Okay, the Western itself is distinctly American. It's based on dime novels and real-life characters. The three essential ingredients in the Western: the hero, the villain, and the landscape. Remember, the landscape is important. That's why in the 50s, CinemaScope, the widescreen, was used very frequently in Westerns so that you could do the wide open spaces. Symbolism, East meets West, fact meets fiction, culture versus nature, culture conflicts. The part about fact meets fiction is forget the facts, fiction, what's important when it comes to a Western. And the new kind of Western are space films, the final frontier, of course. And then the comedy. Comedy is the expression of social repression. The themes were discussed in there were racism, social integration, the comic disintegration and disorder, especially that happened during the Depression, and chaos is contained. In comedy, we do all kinds of wild and weird things like pratfalls, in which in real life somebody is going to get hurt, but in comedies nobody gets hurt, so it becomes funny. And the popular comedy actors, in silent comedy, slapstick is really important, and you have the best of the best is Chaplin and Keaton. And again, that slapstick is kind of physical comedy in which, you know, the pratfall, people fall downstairs, but they don't get hurt. And then early sound films, it becomes one more ingredient, verbal wit. It's now the cleverness of dialogue, and that is exemplified by Laurel and Hardy and the Marx Brothers. The screwball comedy is a hybrid of the romantic and the slapstick. That's especially true of I just lost his name, the Paramount Pictures, guys with Joel McCrea, he was always in them, and Henry Fonda, I can't think of the guy's name right now. Fantastic films, well written, and it's a combination as slapstick there, but also of the verbal wit. There's lots of verbal wit. He did films like Sullivan's Travels, The Lady Eve, and those kinds of films like that at Paramount. And also the comedies that followed Screwball. They are the thesis comedies, the black, dark comedies, your kind of comedy, the raunchy comedy, the family comedy, and so forth. Okay, that brings it all to a close. And if you are confused, bewildered, rattled, depressed, and desperate, like I am, stop by during office hours or send an email, and we'll try to confuse you even more. And remember that it is, the midterm study guide is available online right there. It's on the web. You can get it now on Moodle. And there'll be no makeup exams. You are responsible for your own exam. And that's it, the end. We made it. Thanks. Starts Thursday. See you later. It is, it's